Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by Dr. Peggy Heffington. She teaches at the University of Chicago, and she writes about feminism, women's movements, and motherhood. And in 2023, she published the book, Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother. Dr. Heffington, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
I have to start off with this. The term childless cat woman has become a political catchphrase. To some people it's pejorative, and to some people it's almost something they say with pride, right?
Yeah.
What's your interpretation of this?
So, as an avowed dog person, I never thought I would talk so much about cats, but the impetus for this phrase becoming sort of live in our political moment was a quote from J.D. Vance from actually 2021 where he said something critical about the Democratic Party, that it was run by, quote, childless cat ladies who have no stake in the future. And his idea was that because prominent Democrats, and he listed a number of them, weren't having children of their own, they shouldn't be able to participate in the future of our country because their DNA is not going to be there. There is a real history to the term childless cat lady.
Really?
Yeah. If you go back to the Middle Ages, women who were accused of being witches, oftentimes their relationship with cats would be used as evidence that they were in fact witches.
Interesting.
In the 19th century, suffragettes in the United States were critiqued for having cats and dogs, but a lot of anti-suffragist propaganda used cats as imagery and in rhetoric as a way to suggest that suffragettes had their priorities all screwed up, that they were expending love and time and care on cats rather than on husbands and children. So it's intended as a pejorative, for sure.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I thought was most interesting when this quote from Vance reemerged this summer in the context of having a woman without children running for president was that people who maybe fit that description seem to not find it insulting. They sort of embraced it.
Yeah, I know several people who are proudly calling themselves cat ladies. Yes.
Almost immediately you had childless cat ladies for Kamala t-shirts, and even Taylor Swift signed her endorsement of Harris, signed a childless cat lady.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a hollow argument anyway, because that means that single men shouldn't be involved in the politics of this either, right? I mean, it eliminates a lot of people.
Yeah, and it was, one of the people that Vance included in the list of childless cat ladies was in fact Pete Buttigieg, who at the time, he's now talked about how hurtful those comments were because he and his husband Chasten were going through an adoption journey at the time and had just gotten a really heartbreaking setback. So it's a sort of a lesson of you can never know what somebody is going through.
Right.
But I also think that the embrace of the term indicates a real shift in how comfortable young people are in embracing an identity that does not include having children.
Who knew that there was a long history of this? But what are the surveys saying right now about the birth rate? It's not just people who have cats who are deciding not to have children.
No, and plenty of people with cats do have children. In the United States, the number of babies born each year has been falling for about 10 years, and the number of children per woman, which is the fertility rate, has also been falling. It's now under 1.7. So the number of people having children is going down, and the number of people who say they don't plan to have children has been rising. So millennials have not reached the end of their fertile years, but it's something like 50% of them currently do not have children, and 50% of those people say they don't want children, which would be about 1 in 4, which would be the highest percentage of any generation in American history of people remaining childless.
So it is significant then.
It's significant, yeah.
And then also I understand there's a difference in the survey responses from men and from women in that group, right?
Yeah. Fascinatingly, the Pew Research survey earlier this year, where they found a real disparity between men and women in terms of their desire to have children. So among adults 18 to 35 who do not currently have children, 57% of men say they do want children, and 45% of women say they want children. So I mean, it's a big disparity, and I don't think it can be explained by young women suddenly don't like babies or suddenly like them less than men. But I think it shows that young women today have a real clear-eyed view of who is going to be doing most of that work, whose career is going to be most impacted, and who is going to be doing most of the domestic labor that is involved in child raising.
Right. Now, you published an editorial in the New York Times last year, Why Women Not Having Kids Became a Panic. Yeah. You're not, I understand, you're not advocating anything on this. You're trying to correct the record here, right? So tell us about what you said in that article.
Yeah, so with my book and my work, I'm not advocating that people should or should not have children. Right. Really what I wanted to do with the book was to say two things. One is to counter the narrative, which is we hear from J.D. Vance, but certainly not just J.D. Vance. I think it's across the political spectrum that young people today are doing something new and weird in not having children. I wanted to show with the book that actually women have been actively controlling their reproduction and actively opting out of motherhood for a very, very long time. Yeah. I also wanted to show that the reasons people give for not having children have also remained relatively stable over time. So in surveys today that ask people why they're not having children, their answers are remarkably consistent. They talk about money, they talk about their jobs, they talk about support, meaning, I can't afford daycare, I don't have any family who lives nearby, or I would be doing this all on my own. They talk about environmental concerns. They also cite infertility, which despite the sort of innovations of fertility assistance still remains a major reason why people aren't having kids. And also they cite just the desire to do other things. And if you look back in history, each of those reasons has a very, very long history. People have been sort of prioritizing their economic mobility over having children for centuries. Sure. Women have been deciding between work and motherhood, for decades, if not centuries. Yeah, these reasons are quite old.
One of the ones that you mentioned was climate fears. Obviously, that doesn't have a deep historical background, but you did write an editorial on that for the Washington Post also last year. So to what extent is climate fear an issue here?
A recent survey of 10,000 young people globally found that 6 in 10, so 60% of them, said that they were afraid to have children because of the future of the planet, because of climate change. So that's a really significant thing. And just, anecdotally, when I talk to my own students who are young people, 18 to 22, that is something that's really on their mind, of the ethics of bringing a child into a world that is that is going to be worse in the future.
Yeah, where resources are being depleted.
Absolutely, And the interesting thing is that there actually are historical precedents for people, not necessarily about climate change, that's a relatively contemporary term, but for people choosing not to have children or deciding not to have children because of lack of resources, because of concerns over pollution. That was a big one in the mid-20th century, the environmental movement. And
political unrest, I'm sure, would fall into that
political
category.
Unrest, and economic upheavals, famines. These are all reasons why people have chosen not to have kids in the past.
Now, one of the main ones I would think historically would be lack of support. That's changed a lot through the years, I'm sure. So where are we today with that? I mean, I know there was a time when, probably prior to the Industrial Revolution, where if a child was born into a family, the extended family was around there, grandmothers to babysit, things like that. And then we moved to the nuclear family, and now we're in another category altogether, right?
Yeah. One of the things, very early on in my research, something that I found both fascinating and alarming, because I had just signed up to write a book about women not having children or non-mothers, was that if you don't have to go that far back in the American past to find community structures where the roles of women, whether or not they had biological children, looked very similar. In the American colonies, it was very common for people to sort of shift kids from one household to another. My favorite story is John Hancock, the most flamboyant of our founding fathers, was actually his father died when he was a child. His mother was in really tough financial circumstances, and he got sent to go live with his aunt and uncle. And so he was raised by his childless aunt. His aunt and uncle were unable to have children. They raised him, and it was that family business. They made him their heir. That's what made him the sort of shipping magnate that he was, and how he became a founding father. So it was very common for families to sort of shift children between households, and for women to sort of really participate in raising the children of their sisters, of their daughters, of their neighbors. There was a real sort of community. The idea of child raising was a real community project.
Yeah, and I think of another example of that, more dramatic one, and it's probably true with a lot of ethnic groups. I know on my mother's side of the family, Greece was in pretty difficult times, early 1900s, and her aunts and uncles were shipped over here when they were teens and preteens without their parents.
Right.
Into a community where they knew they had other relatives that were going to pick them up and guide them along and take care of them, and they all did fairly well after they got here. But that was putting a lot of trust in that extended family, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. One historian has put it that in the colonial period, Americans really only thought about the family in the context of the community. It didn't make sense to separate the family and the community out. They understood them as deeply intertwined. And it's only in the early 19th century, after the American Revolution, after all the ideals about individual rights, individual life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that you start to see people internalize that into family structures. And the nuclear family sort of pulls away from the community. And by the middle of the 19th century, I think really ironically, Americans are talking about the nuclear family as the only natural way that people have ever made families, when to their grandparents, great-grandparents, that would not have made any sense.
Yeah, actually that would have been a negative concept for them, probably.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, and a sociologist who studied family structures in the 1860s in France actually noted with alarm that people were pulling away from their intergenerational family units and away from their communities, and instead making these biological family units. He called those family units the unstable family. We would call those the nuclear family. We would call those, the sort of standard, maybe even the, for a long time it was the ideal way of making a family. But from the perspective of people who were used to family structures that had much more support around them, it looked really precarious.
And so what phase are we in at this point? What would you call it?
I think we are still in a place where the nuclear family is understood to be the natural way of raising families. And so this does a couple of things.
Yeah.
For one thing, it means that women, people who don't have children, have no official or unofficial role in raising children. They really don't have a way of participating beyond, watching your friend's kids sometimes.
Yeah.
But there's no real integral role for people without kids. And it also means that the parents, and very often the mother in that nuclear family, are taking on the entirety of responsibility for raising those kids. So I think it isolates people without kids, and it also increases the burden on parents. And one of the, and I think it also has an even further negative effect, because if we say that the nuclear family is the natural way of raising kids, that families should be self-sufficient, then it means that when families need help, when they need support, they are doing something unnatural. They are failing at the correct family structure. There was a couple of years ago in North Dakota, the state legislature was voting on whether they should expand free lunch for kids in schools. And a lawmaker actually got up and said, if parents can't feed their kids, I don't see why that's my problem. And I think that encapsulates so much about how we view the nuclear family, that they are supposed to care for their kids, and if they can't, it's their fault, rather than thinking about raising the next generation as a community project.
I know it's also common for young couples to decide they're going to wait to have children, right? And that's another element of this, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And if you look at the 19th century, young people start waiting in the United States a little bit longer to have kids, the longer a person waits, and that was true in the 19th century, it's true in the 21st century, the longer they wait, the more likely they are to never have kids at all. And that's in part because they get careers going, they get lives going. They establish a way of being an adult that doesn't involve having kids, and then they just sort of never end up doing it.
You know, another factor that's obviously been there historically is infertility. Has that changed as a factor here, or has that pretty much stayed the same?
It was really important to me in my work to include infertility, because I think very often when we talk about women without children, the image we have in our head is of a woman who has prioritized her career or joyfully chosen to have kids because she likes cats more, or has sort of made an active decision. People with infertility have in fact very often tried to have children and then end up not having kids, and it felt very important to me to include them in this sort of broad range of reasons why people might not have kids, from the joyfully opting into a child-free life to someone who, for whom it was a major tragedy. It's a source of grief. In the book, I tell a history of the development of fertility treatments, which are, if you really think about it, it's unbelievable that we can create human life in a petri dish on a lab table. It's truly amazing.
Something that I wouldn't have imagined when I was younger.
And even when the first IVF baby was born in 1978, there was a lot of fear that she would not be, that there was a lot of fear that about the ethics of having done that, and it was only when she was born and was appeared to be a normal child and has now lived a normal life that the floodgates really opened in IVF research, because it showed that you could do this and it would produce a baby that was sort of indistinguishable from any other baby. However, fertility treatments remain incredibly expensive. The people who access them are disproportionately white. They're disproportionately wealthy. Something like 85% make over $100,000 a year.
Really?
And so there are issues of access, but there's also people for whom even after spending all that money and all that time, it still doesn't work. And so I think it is important to continue talking about infertility, because it's something that we feel as though we have solved because fertility treatment exists, but it remains a major reason why people are not having kids.
Yeah, and it's really kind of very shallow of anyone to try to analyze this situation and put everybody in the category of saying, I just don't want to, that's not my lifestyle, I don't want to do that.
Right.
But what about that, lastly here, as long as we're looking at the reasons, what about the group that just says, I can't see myself as a mother, I don't really want to live that lifestyle? How much of a factor is that?
I think it is growing.
Yeah.
In the book, I look back, I try to find echoes of this far back in history, and I find women who became nuns in medieval Europe, some of whom were quite clear that they did not want to be mothers and that being a nun was an alternative. In the 1970s, the term we know now as child-free, which is sort of a term that has been embraced by people who don't have kids as a positive alternative to the term childless, which has a sort of a negative valence.
Implies that it's a burden if you're child-free, right?
It's like sugar-free gum is better for your teeth, right? In the early 1970s, a group emerged called the National Organization for Non-Parents, and they and their very charismatic and polarizing leader, Ellen Peck, were very vocal about advocating for not having kids as a valid lifestyle choice. They staged all kinds of public demonstrations. They had television commercials. They wrote editorials, and they kind of peeved everyone off, from conservatives, and also even among feminists, there was criticism of this group because Peck and some of her followers were very vocal about rejecting motherhood and in fact seeing motherhood as something that was limiting women's options, that women shouldn't be choosing because it was sort of, that smart women wouldn't choose to be mothers.
Right.
So
Yet they were all raised by mothers, right?
Of course.
Of course.
So they didn't make a lot of friends, but what they did do was really raise the visibility of people without kids. And I don't want to be too critical because I think they were also dealing with the stigma. So some of that anger was coming from feeling stigmatized.
Okay, now there's also an understanding that it's increasingly more difficult to raise children today than it was before.
Yeah.
I need to understand that because it seems like we've actually made things easier in a lot of ways, right? So why would someone make the argument that we're in a situation that makes this a little more prohibitive?
I was writing this book during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
It was my COVID project in a way, and during COVID, you couldn't escape the stories of parents and especially mothers who had all of their support networks stripped away from them. There was a massive exit of mothers from the workforce. And there were a lot of stories and sort of outpouring of anger on the part of mothers about how little support they get. That was the pandemic, but I think it also highlighted the extent to which parents are generally piecing together a way of supporting their families in terms of time and in terms of money. And our society doesn't really provide much. And I'm talking about, there is no requirement for maternity leave in the United States. It's one of 2 countries in the world that does not require paid maternity leave for all people. I'm talking about the cost of childcare, which easily runs. The average in the United States is $16,000 a year, but in many places, it's vastly more than that and can cancel out a full salary. It's the fact that schools end at 3 o'clock and jobs end at 7 o'clock.
Right.
So there are all kinds of ways that our society has made it more difficult to have children. So when I make the argument that there is a long history to not having children, this isn't something that millennials invented.
Right.
I also want to be clear that the society we've created has sort of intensified the reasons why people might not have kids, that the economic burdens, the professional burdens, the environmental burdens are weighing more heavily on young people today, and that's why we're seeing numbers go up.
Yeah, they're sensitive to all those things.
Yeah.
I know as a teacher that I'm seeing that. And then on the radical side of this, there's a movement in South Korea.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is the 4B movement. It is South Korean women rejecting 4 things, I think dating, sex, marriage, and having kids, all of which begin with B in Korean. Apparently, I don't speak Korean.
I see.
So
no sex
Yep.
with men, no giving birth, no dating, and no marriage.
And no marriage. And this has been sort of catching some popularity in South Korea for some time. In the wake of the 2024 election, I lost 8 years. 2024 election, it's become something that American women are talking about as well. That the response to the election outcome and the response to things like rollbacks of reproductive rights, that the response should be to withdraw from men and sex and childbearing entirely.
And this is catching on in the United States, you're saying?
There's been a lot of reporting about it.
Yeah.
I don't have any numbers about how many people are actually adhering to it, but I think just the fact that people are talking about it suggests that there is an increasing frustration with the way in which women's lives and women's bodies are talked about.
Yeah. Well, so where might this be headed at this point? Are we going to just continue debating the relevance of childbearing, or do you see one of these movements gaining more support?
One of the things that has, you teach college students as well. They never fail to sort of surprise and delight you. And one of the things I found most interesting about talking to young people about this book is that they see my book as a little bit conservative. Like, they wanted a book that really celebrated a child-free lifestyle.
Yeah.
And of course, as a historian, that's not a thing I do. I don't
Right.
celebrate a lifestyle. But they no longer have the sort of the angst and the sort of stigma that my book it tries to encapsulate.
Yeah.
They are seeing, not having kids as a really valid lifestyle choice that they want to celebrate. And so I think, we're only going towards reducing stigma and possibly towards more people not having kids.
And so of the issues that we mentioned then, the lifestyle argument is probably the one that's gaining momentum.
Yeah, I think so.
That's interesting. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Peggy Heffington for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.